So Jeff, welcome. Are you ready to get started?
I am ready.
So we have a lot to go through, Jeff, today. So I made a lot of outlines because I like to be a teacher. And so teachers make outlines to keep us focused. So our agenda today is three parts. One, we're going to review the Constitution and do a real close Constitution check of where the presidency is in the Constitution, how it's spelled out in Article 2, but also the three branches of government and how they work together to define the presidency's role and balance. Two, we're going to jump back in time, which is always my favorite part, to go in the Wayback Machine and go back to the founding era and say, how did they come up with this idea and what were their worries? And then three, look at some tests of presidential power. Does that sound like a good game plan to you?
That sounds great.
Okay, so let's start. Lots of questions, but let's start with the Constitution. So can you kind of just walk us through Article 2, but also like highlight Article 1 and 3 and just spell out that structural constitution?
Absolutely. Do you think we should screen share the interactive Constitution? Let's read Article 2 so we can actually have a sense of what the powers are. There's so few.
Absolutely. And I have slides too
Oh,
with
even
it in
better.
there. Yeah, I know. I like to highlight things for you.
Um, all right. So the presidency, it's amazing how few powers are in the Article 2 of the presidency. And I always am urging, sort of rushing to go to the interactive Constitution, but rather than doing that right now, let me start summarizing some of the big ones, and then maybe we'll go look at the text. But unlike Congress, which has all of these powers, Article 1, Section 10 just is full of different things that Congress can do. Article 2, which establishes the executive branch, has far fewer powers. The executive branch is responsible for enforcing the law. And in particular, we see that vesting clause. Article 2 vests the executive power of the United States in a single president. So that vesting or installing or allotting or imbuing means the president gets the executive power. So then the question is, what is the executive power? Well, Article 2 sets out the president's role as commander in chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, the ability to appoint judges and executive branch officials with the advice and consent of the Senate, the ability to make treaty, but only if 2/3 of the senators present concur, the ability to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. That's significant. First of all, the pardons can only be for offenses against the United States. It can't be for a state crime. The president can't issue pardons for state crimes. And pardons cannot extend to cases of impeachment. So the president can't pardon himself or other people who might be impeached by the Congress. And finally, the duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. In some ways, that's the broadest, but the least well-defined power. What does it mean to take care that the laws are faithfully executed? And how can the president violate that provision? There are also a bunch of powers that are shared with Congress and are set out in other articles. Article 1 gives the president the power to veto legislation passed by Congress, but Congress can override the president's veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses. And then the Constitution, as we talked about, gives the president to appoint judges, but that has to be approved by the Senate, and the same for treaties. So I think, Kerry, that we have gone through the major powers in Article 2. What do you think?
I think we have. I think what I found so fascinating when looking at the presidency is you really have to look at all three branches and see the connecting points between the three branches to understand how the system works. And so I guess that does bring us kind of closer and back to the founding generation and why they did that. But before we do that, Jeff, you had asked last week, can we do a poll, Curry? And so I added a poll. Do you want to have a real fun quiz game?
Of course.
I know you're like, of course. Let's see what Curry put in here. Okay, everybody, I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and you'll all play along with us. And I will read the questions. So if at any point in time you can't see the questions, I'll read them out loud, and you can put your answers in the chat box. So we'll take the answers both way. So let me begin by launching this poll. And here we go. Can everybody see the poll? I don't know. Make sure everybody can see it. Just let me know in the chat.
There we go.
Good. I just want to make sure they can see it and not see your screen share. That's the only thing I need to check.
I couldn't resist, but
I know. Don't worry.
it actually has the answer in it, so I won't scroll down.
I did for Oh, good. People are answering. So here's the first question of the poll. So what is the minimum age you need to be the president? Is it 40 years old? Is it 35 years old? Or is it 55 years old? Second question. In the early days of the Republic, most presidents only served 2 terms in office. Which president established that precedent? And that's a fun thing to say if you're warming up your mouth. Was it Jefferson? Was it Adams? Or was it Washington? Number 3, next question is, which president broke the 2-term precedent? Was it Andrew Jackson? Was it Wilson? Or was it Franklin D. Roosevelt? And number 4, the next question is, which amendment made it law that the president can only serve 2 terms? Was it the 22nd Amendment or was it the 25th Amendment? And I love that there are answers coming in to the chat as well. So Jeff, now you have to answer these all correctly so everybody knows the correct answer. So first question, what's the minimum age you need to be the president? Is it 40, 35, or 55?
Well, it's easy for me to answer because everyone is rocking it and answering it really well themselves. And it is indeed 35. And now I can just scroll down on the screen and we can see on the interactive Constitution the fact that no person except a natural born citizen or citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of president. Neither shall any person be eligible to that office who shall not have attained to the age of 35 years and have been 14 years a resident within the United States. Friends, you are great to get the right answer. What's so striking about this clause is it's one of the few parts of the Constitution that have a really clear right and wrong answer. Most constitutional questions, there are good arguments on both sides. Here, the answer is clearly you have to have attained the age of 35 and be a 14-year resident within the United States. And that's why 81% of you are right to say 35. The second question, which president established the precedent of serving 2 terms? Of course, that's not in the Constitution because it is a precedent, but once again, you guys are rocking it. And it was indeed President Washington who voluntarily left office. He could have probably won lifelong election. People would have been happy to elect him over and over again, if not for life. But like the farmer Cincinnatus returning to his farm after serving in Rome, Washington voluntarily relinquished power, and that established that important precedent. Which president broke the 2-term precedent? Absolutely, it was Franklin Roosevelt, who served, who was elected to 4 terms, although he passed away at the beginning of his 4th term. And which amendment made it law that the president can only serve 2 terms? It was indeed the 22nd Amendment, and there is some more text. So why don't we go check out the 22nd Amendment and see how clear it is.
And Jeff, after you're done 22nd, then give us a little taste of what the 25th is, because I put that in there so we could talk about both really quickly.
Well, the 25th is very much in the news right now because of COVID. So first, let's look at the 22nd, and it was passed it was proposed in 47. So President Harry Truman is president. Franklin Roosevelt died in 45. So having broken that 2-term limit, Congress proposed and the people agreed that they wanted to reinstate it. So it essentially says no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president shall be elected to the office of president more than once. But it doesn't apply to anyone holding the office when it was proposed. So it wouldn't have prevented Harry Truman from running again. Remember, he took over after most of Franklin Roosevelt's first term, served a second term, chose not to run for a third term. This amendment wouldn't have prevented him from doing that. So that's the 22nd Amendment. The 25th has to do with presidential disability. And we just did a good podcast on this really important question last week, friends, and you can hear it on We the People. And the question basically is, what happens if the president and the vice president become sick of COVID? God forbid that would happen. And neither could serve. Who would become acting president or president? And the 25th Amendment is very complicated, and there are a lot of different parts, but the really controversial and difficult part has to do with what happens when the president is disabled. And I'll summarize it because you can see how long it is. But the gist of it is that when the president, what happens when the president becomes disabled or can't discharge the duties of his office? It says whenever the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive department, that means a majority of the cabinet, or of such other body as Congress may by law provide. Congress just last week proposed creating a new body about presidential disability, but such a body doesn't currently exist. So right now, the only way to certify disability is for the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to transmit to the president pro tempore of the Senate, that's Senator Grassley right now, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, that's Speaker Pelosi, their written declaration that the president can't discharge the powers and duties of his office. Then the vice president immediately becomes acting president. But then what happens if the president gets better and he says, I'm fine? He can send a message to the same people saying, I'm all right, I can be president again. But what happens, and this is the really controversial part, if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet disagree? They say the president says he's all right, I'm feeling better, and never felt like I have more pep, but in fact they think he really can't discharge his office. If the vice president and the majority of the cabinet send another message, there are a lot of messages here, and say, we don't think he's up for taking the job up again, then Congress shall decide the issue, assembling within 48 hours, and Congress by a 2/3 vote. If they decide, both houses, that the president can't discharge his office, then the vice president continues to be acting president. So it's a really high bar that's set for the vice president to be able to continue to serve as acting president over the president's objections. It would take a majority of the cabinet and 2/3 of both houses of Congress. And then things get even more complicated if the vice president is disabled as well. That mostly is set by a federal law called the Succession Act, which was passed in 1947, and puts the Speaker of the House next in line if the president and vice president can't serve. We can talk about that another time, but it's a really interesting question, and COVID has brought it back to the fore.
And like you said, it's a hot topic. Everybody's saying like this, as awful as it sounds, this could be a possibility right now. So we need to dive into the Constitution and dig in more. Now, thinking about the founding fathers, were they worried about this? As they thought about setting up an executive branch, was it always that they were going to have one person, or were there other ideas behind it?
There was a big debate about what kind of president to have. After all, the Constitutional Convention is called because the Articles of Confederation is too weak. It takes unanimous agreement for the states to do anything, and there's no executive leadership. On the other hand, the framers are really afraid of kings. They look to Europe and they see a bunch of tyrants. And so they're faced between the choice between two strong executives in Europe and two weak executives under their own state constitutions, some of which have multiple executives. Because in the Revolutionary era, 11 states didn't give their governors a veto over laws passed by the state legislatures. Most governors are elected not by the people, but by the state legislature. They had to work with an executive council chosen by others. 10 states that the governor's term had only 1 year. No state had a term for longer than 3 years. And the Continental Congress itself had no executive at all. It had a president, but he was just appointed to preside. He had to be a sitting member of Congress. It was basically an honorary position. So the framers are really divided about how strong a president to create. On the one end of the spectrum, there's Alexander Hamilton. You know him from the musical. The musical doesn't stress that Hamilton essentially wanted an elected king. He wanted a president elected for life. And some accused him of being a closet monarchist. There he is in his.
Figured to give you a little image.
Story. Yeah, excellent. On the other hand, there's James Wilson. Do you guys remember him from talking about the preamble and the fact that it was Wilson who came up with the idea that we, the people of the United States as a whole, have the sovereign power rather than we, the people of the individual states? So he really believes in popular sovereignty. And consistent with that belief, he proposed a president elected by the people. What a radical idea. In fact, when he proposed it, there was a gasp in the convention because it was such a radical idea. In fact, it turned out that both of those ideas were too radical for the convention, either a president elected for life or a president elected by the people. There was a third possibility proposed by James Madison, and that was a president elected by Congress, a familiar model for the colonies because many of them elected their governors through the legislature, and that's were some of the options. These choices were embodied in the Virginia plan, which we remember was proposed by the big states and proposed that there should be an executive chosen by Congress to serve a single term, and the executive should have a joint veto power with the judiciary over acts of the Congress subject to a supermajority legislative override. I'm going to pause on that second provision. James Madison thought that was the most important provision in the whole bunch, that basically the president should be able to, the president and the executive should be able to veto the acts of Congress with the concurrence of the judiciary subject to a supermajority legislative override. Madison really cared about that, and he also wanted a provision that would have given Congress the power to override acts of the states, essentially, but that didn't pass. The Virginia plan did not specify the length of the president's term. It didn't say whether the president would play any role in war or diplomacy or grant the president any powers of appointments. So that's the Virginia plan. And the gist of it when it came to the presidency is election by Congress. Then the debate starts. James Wilson insists that the executive should be a single person, which was itself, not at all settled. Connecticut's Roger Sherman wanted to leave the whole question and structure of the presidency to Congress. Virginia's Edmund Randolph described unity in the executive magistracy as the fetus of monarchy. He was afraid that a single president would become like a king. Wilson said a single president would balance the advantages of a powerful king, namely energy and dispatch, with responsibility, in other words, checks by Congress and the American people. And on June 4th, 1787, Wilson eventually convinced his colleagues, including Madison, of the viability of a single executive. So Wilson's the prophet of popular sovereignty, and he says the president is more responsible to the American people. Then the delegates debate the length of the president's term. It's so cool to go on the interactive constitution. I guess I'll resist the urge. But you guys should check it out afterward. Go to the drafting table provision, and you'll see the various proposals for the presidential term. Initially in July, the delegates agreed to a president who'd serve a single term of 6 years. That's consistent with the Virginia plan, but they're open to a longer term. Some are afraid that that's going to create a monarchy. So then they settle on a 4-year term with the president able to run for re-election. And then finally, they come to this crucial question of how the president should be elected. And we settle after debating direct popular vote and legislative election on the Electoral College, which we talked about last week. So that is the core of the debate in Congress. And Kerry, what do you think?
I mean, every week I feel like we say the same thing. They had this idea and they had this idea, and then they compromise and come up with what is in the Constitution. But what I find fascinating about the presidency is, we look at George Washington and we look at what traditions and what norms were set by different presidents that became kind of, at least for us, as this is how the president acts. This is the role of the president. It's what's in the Constitution, and then those precedents around the presidency, which is, again, like I said, really fun to say all this together in one sentence. But there's also tests on presidential power. And what I would love to dive into for the last section, because this was like the number one question we had from all the students on registration, was, can you talk more about presidential powers and executive orders? So can you dive into that and unpack that one a little bit, and then maybe walk through some of the big cases?
Sure. I mean, so many of the controversial questions about executive power today in the news involve executive orders. And you might ask, what's an executive order, and why are presidents able to issue them? After all, the Constitution says the president shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed. It doesn't say that he should make the laws. So an executive order is an order issued by the president without bicameralism and presentment. Bicameralism means presentation to both houses of Congress, bicameral, 2 houses, and presentment means presenting to those houses. The president does it on his own. What authority does he have to make executive orders? Well, it's theoretically under his take care authority, because an executive order in theory is construing authority that he's already been granted by Congress and saying, I'm going to enforce the law in a certain way. So to take some of the most controversial examples, and there are new ones in the news every day, you remember that the question of the Dreamers, the DACA and DAPA programs that granted amnesty to the kids of non-citizens who were here in this country illegally, but allowed the Dreamers or children to stay. Initially, President Obama's decision to issue an executive, to give them amnesty was issued as an executive order. And then President Trump's decision to withdraw the amnesty was also an executive order. Now, the Supreme Court disagreed really vigorously about the constitutionality of both executive orders for complicated reasons. In the case of President Obama, the court split 4-4 about whether existing immigration law authorized the president to grant that amnesty. And in the case of President Trump, the court divided 5-4 about whether or not the president had gone through the right administrative hoops in changing the policy, and ultimately said that he hadn't. But the core of executive orders, and here's a wonderful case from constitutional law that I'll tell you about. It's called the Youngstown Sheet and Tube case. And this case, more than anyone, sets out how you're supposed to evaluate an executive order when the president issues it. It's an amazing case because the facts are so incredible. It's right after World War II, and President Harry Truman wants to seize the steel mills because he thinks that they're necessary to keep up military production for the Korean War. And he tries to do it under his military authority as commander-in-chief of the army. He says, I have the power to seize the steel mills and to tell them to start making their steel for military and not civilian production. And he issues an executive order to do that, invoking his power as commander-in-chief. It goes up to the Supreme Court. Does he have the power to do that? And the court says, no, you do not have the power to do that. And the main opinion was not the majority opinion, but it was written by Justice Robert Jackson, one of the greatest writers in the history of the court. And he set forth 3 categories for evaluating whether or not an executive order is valid. And they're pretty easy to remember. So here they are. When the president acts with congressional approval, in other words, when his executive order is clearly supported by a congressional statute, his power is at its zenith or its height, or he has the most power. When he's acting in the face of congressional disapproval, when Congress says don't do that, and he does it anyway, then his power is at its nadir or lowest point, or he's weakest. And then when Congress hasn't spoken very clearly and it's not obvious what the answer is, then the president occupies in a zone of twilight. And I always think of that old TV show from when I was a kid. So there's no way you guys are going to remember it. The Twilight Zone. Do, 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 do. And that's what happens when the president's in the zone of twilight.
I wish I had the music. I'm so sorry.
But maybe you'll remember it that way because you can think of that spooky music and realize that when the law isn't clear, the president's in the zone of twilight. Now, mostly the law isn't so clear, because if it were, then the president probably wouldn't be issuing the executive order to begin with. So that's why all the hard cases before the Supreme Court often fall within the zone of twilight, but deciding in which category the president's orders go will be crucial in determining whether or not he has the power to do that. And that was the case when President Trump, for example, tried to build the wall in Mexico, even though Congress tried to pass a resolution saying you can't do that. And the president, made clear his opposition to that law. And then he invoked some other authority and said he was just moving around money. So the technicalities are really important. But the bottom line, the big takeaway is the framers thought Congress would be the most dangerous branch and most legislation would take place through laws passed by both houses of Congress. Today, now that Congress is so polarized and often can't agree about how to act, much lawmaking takes place through executive order, and that's on flimsier constitutional grounds because it has to be supported by statute. And that's why so many executive orders go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is involved in so much presidential lawmaking.
Okay, that's fascinating. Now, we have a question in the chat I'm going to get to in a second, and I just wanted to list some of the more recent, well, 1926, not so recent, but some of the court cases around this. The one thing that have been talking about this week is for students, when they hear an executive order come up, and great question in the chat, which category does the recent executive orders on healthcare fall in? What are the tools they can use to be like the Supreme Court justices and measure it, like, and say, where is the presidential power and what are the boundaries around it, and look for where it falls on either side of the zone of twilight?
Great question, Cynthia Geller. So the core Supreme Court cases about healthcare do not involve executive orders. They involve whether the statute itself passed by Congress violates the Constitution or not. So if you've been watching Judge Barrett's hearings, which are taking place right now, and also yesterday, you'll know that there's a case coming up to the Supreme Court next month, Texas versus California. And the question is, when Congress zeroed out the mandate, which requires people to buy healthcare or pay a fine, when Congress in 2017 reduced that fine to zero, was it still possible to consider the fine a tax? Because in upholding the Affordable Care Act in 2013, the court, by a 5-4 vote, said that the mandate could be upheld under Congress's taxing power, and that was the core to its constitutionality. And challengers today say when Congress reduced the penalty to zero, it's no longer a tax, and therefore the law is unconstitutional. The second question is, if you agree that the law is unconstitutional, can that unconstitutional provision be severed or cut out of the law so the rest of it can stand? Conventional wisdom, which is often wrong, but is embraced by judges on both sides of the spectrum, and scholars as well, is that even though some justices might possibly agree that the mandate is no longer a tax now that it's been zeroed out, people seem to feel that there's likely to be a majority in favor of severing that provision and saving the rest of the law, on the theory that Congress couldn't have intended to strike down the whole law when they zeroed out the penalty, or else they would have repealed the whole law, which they didn't do. So, Cynthia, that suggests that those disputes involve a construction of the constitutionality of a statute, not an executive order. Now, there are decisions that the president makes about how to enforce the Affordable Care Act, and when President Obama decided to defer enforcing parts of the act and enforce others, some claimed that he was violating his duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Those legal challenges didn't go very far. But unless I'm missing something, most of the disputes about healthcare don't involve executive orders.
Got it. Good question. Is there a way to kind of measure executive orders and say what's the first thing we look at? Like, if you are a lawyer saying you want to say that this executive order is viable, what's the first kind of steps they're going to take to give that executive order weight or support?
Well, I mean, the first question is it authorized by Congress? Because if there's an argument that it's completely in the face of congressional disapproval, then it's going to be hard to support. But then there are all sorts of complicated and different arguments depending on the case, like in the Trump case involving the decision to repeal DACA. The question is, did he obey the rules set out in the Administrative Procedure Act? So generally, don't jump to any conclusions about a case challenging an executive order. There are different grounds for challenging them, different grounds for upholding them. But the fundamental question is it consistent with or in opposition to the will of Congress?
Awesome. That's good to kind of like keep that as like the guiding principle around it, so we understand what the role of the president is, what the duties of the president are, and then how we understand this effect with other parts of the Constitution and the government. So great final question in the chat from Colin. How much power over all executive agency does the president have? And is that power in the right balance?
Great question, complicated question, Colin. Yeah. Because, in theory, the president, as head of the executive branch, retains the executive power, which is unitary, and he says it can't be divided, and he controls executive agencies. And therefore, as you say, in the CFPB case, the Consumer Financial Protection Board case, the court did rule that its head was unconstitutional because it couldn't be fired by the president, and as head of the executive branch, the president had to have the power to fire the head of the CFPB. On the other hand, the court has upheld certain quasi-independent agencies, and in a case called Humphrey's Executor in the 1930s, the court said that some independent agencies, like the Federal Reserve or the Federal Communications Commission and so forth can be insulated from presidential firing. In other words, there has to be some cause. The president can't just fire the head because he doesn't like the head, or you can have staggered terms. Now, some Supreme Court justices, including the late Justice Antonin Scalia, say that Humphrey's executor case was wrong and should be overturned, and the president should have total power to fire any executive branch head, calling into question the constitutionality of independent agencies themselves. It's not at all clear there's a majority position for that on the Supreme Court right now. All we can do is say that as a matter of law, Humphrey's executive remains on the books, and you can, in some cases, have quasi-independent agencies where the president's power to fire is more limited.
Fascinating. I think that's an amazing class in walking through, from start to finish, going from 35 years old to federal agencies and whose right and job is it to hire and fire. Fascinating how the presidency has changed over time, but then the foundational pieces in the Constitution. I have to say that my two favorite parts of this class this week has been the zone of twilight, because that's just super cool. I was like, wow, this is so much fun. I know, but it makes sense. Like when you spell out that concurrence and say, when working together, they have more power, more right. When working apart, they have less. That was the intent of the founders. That, if you work together, you might not be perfect. The Supreme Court could push you back, but you still have more power and more agency. And I think the other thing is really understanding that take care clause. And I don't think that is something that we talk to students enough about what that really is and what that means as a duty and a job and a power as well. So Jeff, thank you so much. Any final words to kind of wrap up our class today?
Gosh, it's so important to study the presidency, and we really need to study presidential practice, because as we started off by saying, the president's actual constitutional authorities are pretty limited. But this huge amount of power has accrued over time, starting at the time of Washington, but mostly through the executive orders. And I guess if you want to really learn about when the shift took place, it was around the Progressive era, around 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson succeeded William Howard Taft. I love Taft because I wrote a little book about him as the last constitutionalist president. He thought that the president's powers were really limited, and he became Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court and kind of articulated that view in judicial opinions. But after him, presidents starting with Woodrow Wilson took the view that the president was a steward of the people who directly represented their will, therefore could rule by executive orders. The numbers of executive orders started really going up under Wilson. They hugely spiked under President Franklin Roosevelt. And then ever since President Reagan, they've been steadily rising. So this is not a partisan issue. Democratic and Republican presidents in the post-war era have been ruling by executive order in ways that the framers would not have anticipated. And I'd love you to think about whether you think that's a good idea or not. And if not, what can be done about it.
And that is fascinating. And now I want that graphic as a chart visual. So I will get that and put it on the website, because that is exactly how my brain was thinking, like, can we chart this over time? And you can see that upswing. So I'm going to close out class. We do have a couple follow-up questions, so Jeff, don't leave us. But thank you all very much and have a great day. Hope to see you all on Friday at 1 o'clock, where we're going to dive deep into the presidency with Jeff Rosen and Holly Frey. We're going to look at the presidency and the powers around the presidency, and then also look at the White House and how we understand kind of that symbolic place and space around the president and how that's changed over time. So a really fun Friday session, and we'll thank you all very much. Have a great day, everyone.